this episode, we'll be virtually taking a trip to the Philly suburbs to talk with author Lew Bryson. The man with the infectious laugh walks me through his 25-year career. From the early days writing about beer to learning how to drink whiskey. Join me as he teaches a masterclass on bourbon, rye, and scotch. Welcome to No Pants During the Pandemic. Hi, I'm Kevin Brooks, and this is No Pants During the Pandemic. This time, I'm joined by author Lew Bryson. Hey Lew, how you doing today?
Hey Kevin, how are you?
I'm doing just fine. Let's jump right into things. For the viewers who aren't familiar with your work, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
My name's Lew Bryson. I have been writing about beer and whiskey for the last, 25 years.
Let's go back those 25 years. How'd you start writing about beer?
I got fascinated by beer fairly early on. It was back in the, actually I can tell you exactly when it was. I was drinking beer, but hadn't really thought about it much. And then it was actually Holy Thursday in 1981. I don't remember the date, but I remember that it was Thursday of Holy Week because my history professor in college, I had a medieval history prof, took me and a friend to a bar in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, no longer open, the Lausus Hotel. I went to Franklin and Marshall College in Lancaster, and it was right down the street that ran through campus. And we went in there, and in 1981, the bar had 125 different beers, which in 81 was amazing. I mean, it knocked my eyes out. I was stunned, and I still remember the first beer that Wilhelm Lausus handed to me. It was an Altenmünster, German Pils, and it was just so different from everything I'd been drinking. I mean, I was a Rolling Rock drinker at the time, and this was, I don't even know, even now I can't describe how it was so different from everything I'd been eating. It's like I'd been eating boiled rice and somebody handed me a steak. Just so much more flavor, so much more interesting. I was hooked. That one night I had to have more of this stuff, more of this different kinds of stuff. Wilhelm had Duvel, he had Berliner Weiss, he had Hefeweizen, he had I think the Ruddles County Bitter, had all kinds of stuff. Everything he could get in, he got it for the bar. I mean, that's when I started getting interested, and then I started keeping a notebook. I happened to have it with me, and I started taking notes. I still have that notebook and just a box full of others. My daughter actually indexed them for me last year, which has been a tremendous help. Actually, I used that a lot in writing the book because everything was in there. I knew where to go and what notebook everything was in. So I got practice in writing about beer by doing the notebooks because I would just write down whatever thoughts came to me. I was keeping track of how many different beers I had, different places I went, what beers I had with what food. And I was starting to make a couple of trips to Europe. We went to Ireland on our honeymoon in '89, that was. And then in the early 90s, I was working for a small pharmaceutical company in the Philadelphia area in Fort Washington. And I was actually the librarian. I started out as a librarian. That was my profession early on. One of the things I put in for the company was an email system within the company. And there were homebrewers at the company, all chemists, of course. And I started writing up things about beer because I'd been reading everything I could get my hands on. And I was writing up geographical bits about beer, how beer was brewed, what made hops different, and all kinds of stuff like this, what malt was. About a month before the company went under, this buddy of mine, a chemist, brought in a newsletter that he'd gotten from his local beer store, a place in North Wales, Pennsylvania, and he tossed it on my desk and said, "This is crap. You write better than this." And I looked at it and I'm like, "I do." So I had and this was back in, wow, 94, January of 94. And I had this really primitive desktop publishing program, and put together a front and back, just two sides, newsletter about beer. I think I wrote about Yingling because I knew it. And I took it up to the beer distributor and I said, a friend of mine brought your newsletter by. I thought it was a great idea for selling beer. If you want to sell the better beer and make more money, because it was obvious that the guy was trying to sell that kind of beer. I said, the more education you have, the better. I said, look, here, I wrote this up. If you like it, we can talk about doing another one. This one's free, and maybe I would want to charge you for the next one. He took it. He started paying me for that. I think I worked for that guy for 7 years doing newsletters. Well into when I was doing this full time, but I just kept doing it for him as, because I liked the guy and it was my first gig. Luckily, the first issue that I did, a guy who lived around there picked it up and was friends with John Hansel, who had started Malt Advocate, and took a copy to him and said, "This guy's pretty good. He should write for you." And John got in touch with me. I wrote an article about ice beer, of all things. And that got me started. And then Tony Forder at Ale Street News saw that and got in touch with me. I did their Mid-Atlantic column for, I think like 12 years. I did some things for All About Beer. And then I was writing regularly for Malt Advocate, and I did the editor thing and kind of got established.
One thing I don't think people realize now, especially even as late as the mid-90s, there wasn't a lot of beer writing out there.
Right.
I think the first two books I remember seeing on beer were Michael Jackson's book and on homebrewing, Charlie Papazian's book.
Sure.
Both of which had been around for a while. It's interesting, now you can just reach out onto your computer, but, back then you either had to go to your bookstore and pray they had something.
Right. Or mail order.
Yeah, one of those little sketchy CompuServe or AOL bulletin boards.
Right. Homebrew Digest. I subscribed to that for a while.
I remember, you'd be on those boards and these guys that I knew the name of from reading the books and magazines, they were on the boards with you.
That's how I met Garrett Oliver. I met him on CompuServe.
But for me, at least the writing part, the game changer was probably picking up my first Michael Jackson book, and hearing him talk, elevating beer.
Right. And the thing was with Jackson, it wasn't just about beer. It was about beer's place in the culture, in the country. It wasn't even just culinary. People talk about, beer, food. It was history. It was commerce. I remember his writing about Bamberg just really hammered home what a place beer had in the history of that town the whole area of Franconia. You couldn't separate beer and brewing from the history of that province, state, whatever they're called.
That's actually one of the things I think is lacking, at least in the American beer scene, but starting in global, we're lacking that historical context in many cases. It's just the breweries now, it's just, some building in an industrial plaza that has a tap room, and it's just like, oh, because to me, the history and as well as the taste and all the things combined to make it a very interesting and fun industry, and I think it's starting to lose some of that.
Maureen Ogle's book, Ambitious Brew, really did a great job of putting American brewing in its place in the country's history, but there hasn't been a lot since then. I'm still waiting for a really good book about how we got from the 1950s, when we still had a number of large regional brewers, through to now, when we have thousands and thousands of small places, breweries in every town. My town's 2,000 people, got a brewery. The town my wife and I are retiring in, 900 people got a brewery. Had a brewery for 10 years. How did that happen? What drove that? And I get the same question with whiskey. Why did whiskey become popular again? I have theories, but I don't know. I think there are larger forces at work on both sides, beer and whiskey. Beer, whiskey, wine, cider, mead. Who the hell would have thought there would be hundreds of meaderies by now? Not me. It's somewhat bizarre when you think about it, how far we've come in some ways. We've got 10,000 wineries, we've got 8,000 breweries, we've got, if we aren't over 2,000, we're closing in on distilleries. Of course, these are all 2019 figures, and things will probably change a lot, but we're still going to have thousands of these places.
So your first book, you did basically the guide to Pennsylvania breweries.
Right. It was really a travelogue. I broke the state up into sections and then covered all the breweries in those sections. The first edition of the book, things were stretched a bit because we had to find something to talk about in parts of the state where there weren't any breweries, but that caught up pretty quickly. One of the things I did in the guidebook that I got a lot of nice critique on was that I talked about things in the area other than the beer. I also talked about the good beer bars in the area, but I talked about tourist attractions in the area, how you can get to the place. My dad suggested put in parking. People want to know where to park. So I had a bunch of other stuff besides the narrative on each brewery, and it's been kind of gratifying to see other people use that same model, even though I had to be honest, it was my editor that came up with it, not me. But it was good. I got my feet wet. I found out I could do a book. It made a big difference in my work. You write a book and people take you more seriously. It opens doors for you. You don't make a lot of money. I think the only breweries book I made any kind of money on was the 4th edition of Pennsylvania. Some of that was because the interest in beer was picking up. I've made a nice amount of money on tasting whiskey, but not anything that would keep me, it wouldn't pay the mortgage. It's a nice addition to my income. That's what freelancing is like. You get a little bit here, a little bit there, and hopefully it all adds up to the nut that you need.
That PA book would be a lot different if you wrote it now.
The number of breweries in Pennsylvania, I think when I wrote the first book, it was just over 40 breweries. By the time I wrote the 4th edition, I can't recall if it was over 100 or just under. And now there's almost 100 distilleries in Pennsylvania now. Breweries, I don't remember the last count I made. I think there were over 300. And I'm sure there's more than that now. Of course, I don't know how much longer they're going to stay up. I hate to have to keep saying that. It's just making me nuts. It's the worst part of this, knowing that how many things we're going to lose and we won't see again. Sorry, I hate to drop that bomb, but whenever I start thinking about the numbers of how things were just a few months ago before we saw this coming, I guess it doesn't depress me yet. It's still in the disbelief phase. But I'm looking down the road. I'm thinking about small restaurants that won't reopen. I'm thinking about distilleries, breweries. I think it's going to be particularly tough on the distillers because they haven't been through any kind of shakeout yet. They've been kind of paralleling the development of craft brewing, but they haven't had that mid-90s moment where a rationalization takes place and people who aren't really good at business get shaken out of the business.
I think a lot of the places that are going to go, it's just going to be where they are or where they were business wise when this all hit.
Yeah.
How much money they are. Say if they had just gotten bigger. Just
unfortunately, it's going to be like beer. It's not going to be just the crap places that go under. There's going to be some good places that don't make it because, and maybe not even because of bad business practices, just because of bad timing.
Yeah.
Right now, it doesn't matter what your business plan was or how experienced you were. If you opened a new brewery 6 weeks ago, yeah, you're hosed. You know, and it's just timing. It's
Yep.
nothing else. Russian River had just opened a large new tap room. You know, I mean, it was a smart move until mid-March. And then all of a sudden it wasn't again.
I know. Now, how did you make the turn from writing about beer to writing about whiskey?
I was writing pretty much exclusively about beer. It was all I knew. It was all I really wanted to write about. And at that time, I don't think I really thought of myself as a writer. I sold my first writing in, I don't know, spring of '94. And I was on unemployment for about a year. The company I was working for folded. And about 2 weeks later, my second kid was born. So I was taking care of the kids and I was learning to write and learning how to sell it. Right about the time I was getting on my feet, the microbrewery shakeout came along in '96. And that's when I had become the managing editor at what was then Malt Advocate. John Hansel asked me to come up to his place in the Lehigh Valley and went up there and we sat down and drank Baltic Porter and smoked cigars. And I found out that I was going to have to learn to drink whiskey because we were going to become a whiskey magazine because brewers weren't buying ads, which was not as easy as that sounds. But I was also starting from essentially zero on knowledge of whiskey, the history, how it was made, anything. I knew there was bourbon and there was Scotch, and I think I knew there was Canadian. That was about the end of my knowledge.
How does one learn to like whiskey?
I took it fairly seriously. I learned how to drink whiskey, which wasn't easy. I mean, now I can just take a whiskey and, you know, I'm tasting all kinds of things. Herbal rye, the sweetness from the malt in it, the wood influence. There's a framing of oak at the back. I mean, when I first started doing that, it was just, oh, God, that hurts. It's hot. It's fire. I had to drink whiskey every day to get over it. But that's really how it works. Essentially, your tongue stops screaming and you can hear your taste buds. Your taste buds have been telling you what's there all along. Your nose really has been telling you what's there all along. But literally, the pain receptors in your tongue get hit by the alcohol and they just scream bloody murder and your brain can't hear anything else. So once my tongue got used to getting hit with whiskey, I started writing about both. I mean, there was a transition period where I would write about beer for the magazine. I would also write about whiskey for the magazine. And the more I learned about whiskey, the more I wrote about whiskey. And I quickly found out that newspaper and magazine editors were much more willing to pay for a whiskey story than for a beer story, even though beer was growing like crazy and whiskey was still pretty much in the doldrums. I mean, I remember the first couple of pieces I wrote about whiskey for any publication other than Malt Advocate. I was writing for trade journals, and all of them were things like, well, you know, whiskey didn't decline quite as much this year. That's the situation we were in. I still don't know exactly why whiskey turned around. I don't think anybody knows every reason. I remain convinced that one of the reasons is because people were tired of being lied to. I think people didn't like the bullshit stories that marketers were giving them. And whiskey had a really good story, an interesting story, and it was true. None of it was made up. You malt the grain, you ferment the grain, you run it through a still made of copper and steel, and then you put it in an oak barrel for years in a warehouse. And then when you bring it out, it looks like this instead of like clear vodka. It's picked up color from the wood. And all of that is true. I mean, just the story of the Beam family. I did a piece for the Daily Beast on the Beam family recently. And just that is an amazing story. They are so connected. Once you read that piece and understand the influence it's hard to imagine American whiskey without the Beams. It's wild. And it's a great story. And I think that's a lot of what brought the whiskey resurgence around. And I got to tell a lot of it. I got to be one of the storytellers that was bringing that story to people's attention.
Why don't you tell me about your new book?
Okay. The new book is Whiskey Master... Oh, there it is. It's right there. Whiskey Masterclass just came out in February of 2020. It was inspired by something Bill Lumsden said to me, the master blender at Ardbeg and Glenmorangie. It's a rule of thumb in Scotch whiskey that 50% of the flavor comes from the barrel. And Bill said, when I hear that, my first thought is, where's the other 50% come from? I'm listening to it, and I'm writing it down. I thought, there's a book there.
How'd you turn this idea into a book?
So what I did was take the whiskey making process from grain selection to bottling and just a little bit beyond. I wanted to get at every single step that either adds, creates, or takes away flavor in whiskey making. So grain selection, is it a corn whiskey, a malt whiskey, a rye whiskey, a wheat whiskey? And what difference does that make? And then take those grains even before you ferment them. How are they milled? How are they mashed? How are they malted? What's malted? What isn't? These things have very small influences on the flavor, but if you didn't do it, it would make a difference. So even though it's small, it's significant. I talked with one Canadian distiller. He had a hammer mill for his grains. I said, why do you use a hammer mill instead of a roller mill? And he said, well, for one thing, it's more volume. We can process it faster. But he said, I think it makes a difference in how the flour comes out. Well, okay, so that makes a difference. Fermentation, what kind of yeast do you use? How hot do you let the fermentation get? How long does it take? Do you ferment on the grains or off? In bourbon, you ferment with the grains and everything in there. Scotch, it's more like beer. You run the wash off and ferment that. And then distillation. All the different types of still, pot stills, column stills, single column stills, double column stills, hybrid stills, extractive stills, vacuum stills, and then how you run them. There's a whole section in the book on the different shape and geometry and size of pot stills in making Scotch whiskey, and all that makes a difference. There's a difference with how it's condensed once it comes off the still, what they call worm tubs and shell and tube condensers. All makes a difference. And then, of course, you go into the barrel, different types of barrels, where the barrels are in the warehouse, what kind of warehouse it is, where the warehouse is, do you have the windows open or not, is the warehouse heated, is it not heated, some of it is aged in caves. All this makes a difference. How much water you put in makes a difference in the flavor. And it's not about how strong it is. A whiskey will taste different at different dilutions, and that one where it expresses exactly what the master blender wants it to, that's what they'll bottle it at. And then, of course, the type of bottle you put it on, the type of label, all that works on your mind, and it really does affect how you think the whiskey tastes. The people who explain the whiskey to you, the bartender who pours it for you, the glass it's in, are you healthy that day? Do you feel good? Did you just eat? Are you going to eat? That all makes a difference. Every single bit of that makes a difference in how the whiskey smells and tastes. And that's what I tried to put in this tiny little volume, just this wee thing.
That's a lot to include.
And I've said a number of times, if I have any kind of gift in writing, if I have any kind of signature trademark in writing, it's that I can make a complicated thing easier to understand and make it sound like we're sitting down having a drink together. I like to think that I do achieve that in my voice, my writing, and people are saying that about this book as well as about Tasting Whiskey.
How do the two books differ?
Tasting Whiskey was more of a survey course of whiskey, a little bit of everything about a little bit of everything, and this is more like the 200 level course, a focus in on one particular aspect of whiskey.
It came out in February. It came out mid-February? Was it like the 12th?
Yeah, the 18th.
Mine arrived from Amazon, and then basically, the country shut down like the week after.
Yeah.
So you basically haven't been able to really promote this except for online.
My book tours were canceled. I had a week in Chicago. I was going to Louisville. I was going to Pittsburgh. I was going to New England. Going to New Orleans. All that just evaporated like everybody else's. Every other book I've ever done, I've traveled around. I've gone to bookstores. I've gone to bars. I've gone to anywhere. I've talked to American Legion posts. I go and talk to library groups. I did one thing at the 92nd Street Y in New York. Essentially anywhere I can talk. Actually done a number of things with my alumni association. They've been really helpful. Done a number of events with them as far out as Denver. I've got $3,000 worth of books sitting in my garage doing nothing. So I really understand on a smaller scale how some bars feel. So, I mean, I'm doing things like this. I'm talking about the book on social media. I'm relying heavily on people reviewing it on Amazon. I mean, unfortunately, the book's sales started out strong, but everything's petering off. Whiskey book sales, particularly, just not doing that well on Amazon right now. The books that are doing well, cocktail guides, like how to make your own drinks at home, and home distilling books. Home distilling books are booming right now. Which of course is completely illegal and dangerous. And I don't mean, you'll go blind. Completely aside from that, hot alcohol vapor is highly explosive. And I'm really afraid we're going to see some garages blowing up.
How do you think sales will be in the future?
I'm sure once things start up again and I can take it out on the road, we'll be fine. It'll pick up again. And I can talk to people about it because tasting whiskey never really dropped out. I continued to do promotional events on that last year, and people were happy and showed up and bought the book. So I'm optimistic.
Best of luck with it. If you'd like to learn more about Lew's works, check out his website. If you're interested in buying either Whiskey Masterclass or Tasting Whiskey, the links are in the video's description. Join me next time when Lew and I continue our talk, and I get a whiskey primer. Thanks for watching. Cheers.